All right, for anyone prepping for GS Paper 4, you've definitely come across utilitarianism, that classic idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. But here's the thing. At the very heart of this theory, there's a puzzle, a real paradox that, on the surface, just doesn't seem to make any sense.
So let's get into it. The man at the center of this whole thing is Jeremy Bentham, pretty much the father of modern utilitarianism. He's the guy who famously called the idea of natural human rights nonsense on stilts. Yet, believe it or not, he was also one of the very first major Western thinkers to argue that we need to treat animals ethically. So how on earth is that possible? Stick with me, because that's exactly the puzzle we're going to solve today.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get into Bentham's one big idea. Then we'll tackle both sides of that paradox, his really harsh take on rights, and his surprisingly modern view on suffering. After that, we'll see how John Stuart Mill came along and tweaked the theory. And then, most importantly for you, we'll connect it all back to governance in India today.
To really get Bentham, you only need to understand one single powerful idea that he applied to, well, everything. He called it the principle of utility. You can think of it as the master key that unlocks his entire way of thinking.
So what is utilitarianism? At its core, it's a consequentialist theory. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying that it doesn't really care about your intentions or some abstract moral code. All that matters are the results. The only question is, what are the consequences? Does this action, this law, this policy, does it create the most happiness and the least suffering for the most people? That's it.
You see, Bentham didn't start with some grand abstract ideas. He started with something he saw as a simple biological fact about us. We are all, at our core, wired to run towards pleasure and run away from pain. He believed these two sovereign masters were the foundation for everything, for morality, for law, for all of it. And that leads us to the big one, the phrase everyone knows. This is the ultimate goal. For Bentham, this was the yardstick you measure everything against. Every single law, every government policy, every personal action. Does it produce the most happiness for the most people? If the answer is yes, it's good. If it's no, it's bad. It's a really simple but incredibly radical and influential idea. Okay, so now let's use that yardstick and apply it to the first piece of our puzzle. Bentham's really controversial and very famous rejection of what we call natural rights. This is probably one of Bentham's most famous lines. And when you hear it today, it's pretty shocking, right? I mean, how could anyone just dismiss the whole idea of fundamental human rights? But for Bentham, this wasn't just him being difficult. It was a matter of pure logical consistency. Here's how he thought about it. To Bentham, these so-called natural rights were just a fiction. You can't see them, you can't touch them, you can't measure them. So how could you possibly prove they actually add to real-world happiness? He argued that the only rights that really matter are legal rights, the ones a government actually creates and enforces. And even then, those rights are only good if they pass the utility test. Do they demonstrably make society as a whole happier? For Bentham, a right wasn't some sacred, abstract truth. It was a practical tool, and it had to work.
So now let's flip to the other side of the paradox. Because the exact same principle, the very same logic, that made him reject abstract human rights also pushed him towards a conclusion that was literally centuries ahead of its time. And there it is. This is his groundbreaking argument for why we should care about animals. Just look at the logic here. He completely dismisses the things people usually point to, like reason or speech, the things we use to say humans are superior. Instead, he focuses on the only thing that matters for his calculation, the real, actual, measurable experience of suffering. So here's the solution to our puzzle. Bentham wasn't being contradictory at all. He was being brutally consistent. His logic was simple. If morality is all about maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering, then anything that can suffer has to be part of the moral equation. An animal's pain is real. It's a measurable negative that reduces the total amount of good in the world. An abstract right, on the other hand, had no measurable impact for him. And you know what? This same logic is why he was a huge advocate for government transparency, because making government accountable is a measurable way to increase the public's happiness. But of course, Bentham's version of utilitarianism wasn't perfect. A lot of critics attacked it, saying it was a doctrine worthy only of swine, basically reducing all of human experience to just seeking simple pleasure. And this is where his student John Stuart Mill steps into the story to give the theory a much-needed upgrade. John Stuart Mill was raised from birth on these strict utilitarian principles. He and his wife, the brilliant philosopher Harriet Taylor Mill, set out to defend the theory by making it, well, more sophisticated, more human.
They wanted to fix its weaknesses and make it something people could actually get behind.
This fantastic quote really captures Mill's big idea. He basically challenged Bentham's notion that all pleasures are equal. Mill said, no, wait a minute. He introduced a huge distinction. There are higher and lower pleasures. The pleasures of the mind, like intellect, art, morality, creativity, are just qualitatively better and more valuable than simple physical feelings. So you can see the key differences right here. Where Bentham only cared about the quantity of pleasure, he famously said pushpin is as good as poetry, Mill introduced the idea of quality. This also led Mill to favor what we call rule utilitarianism. The idea here is that it's better to follow general rules that usually promote happiness rather than trying to calculate the consequences of every single individual act. And so, importantly for modern government, he argued that individual liberty, protected by his famous harm principle, is absolutely essential for society's happiness in the long run.
Okay, this is all fascinating philosophy, but what does it actually have to do with being an administrator in India today? The answer is pretty much everything. The basic logic of utilitarianism is baked into the DNA of modern public policy. You can see a direct line from the theory to how things get done. The philosophical goal of the greatest good gets translated into the practical administrative tool of cost-benefit analysis. I mean, think about it. What is a CBA, if not an attempt to add up all the pleasure, the benefits, and subtract all the pain, the costs of a project? This is the very foundation of the data-driven policymaking that's so crucial today. And you see this logic everywhere in the Indian context. When the government does a cost-benefit analysis for a new dam or highway, that's utilitarian thinking. The direct benefit transfer scheme is a perfect example. It's designed from the ground up to maximize welfare for the greatest number by cutting out waste. The RTI Act, that's pure Bentham. Transparency leads to accountability, which increases public good. Even large-scale public health programs like vaccination drives are based on this idea that the massive benefit to society far outweighs the small inconvenience or risk to individuals. So let's circle all the way back to where we started. That paradox? We can see now that there really wasn't one. Bentham wasn't contradicting himself. His rejection of abstract rights and his surprising embrace of animal welfare, they both came from the exact same place, a radical, relentless, and totally consistent focus on one thing, maximizing measurable good and minimizing measurable suffering in the real world. And that leaves us with one final, really important question for you as a future civil servant. On paper, the greatest good for the greatest number sounds like a perfect guide. But what happens when the happiness of the many seems to require the sacrifice of the few? What happens when that new highway that's going to benefit thousands of people displaces a small, vulnerable community? Is utilitarianism a clear, reliable guide for ethical action, or can it sometimes become a dangerous justification? That is the tough question you'll have to wrestle with in your career, and definitely something to think about for your ethics paper.